Okay, I'm here with Mr. Karl Dahl. How are you doing, brother?
Doing well, sir.
I'm happy to have you, man. I've been catching up on your episodes with Pete, and as the listeners know, Pete is an old friend of mine. We've known each other since like 2018, I guess it was, around the time I started my podcast, and he started his. So he was like my second interview on my podcast with
Oh,
Pete.
nice, nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, Pete's a
so
great guy.
good dude. I've known him for a long time. Um, he was telling me that you are the guy to talk to about the Spanish Civil War, and it's odd. I noticed this last night. I was listening to or no, the night before. I was listening to After Party with Emily Jasinski. However you say her name, Jasinski, and she had Andrew Clavin's son. I think his name's Spencer was on her podcast, and they brought up Eric Vogelin. And I was like, man, it is so weird to hear some of this like more esoteric stuff that I'd been reading for the last couple of years starting to pop into the mainstream, mindset. And I've noticed that the Spanish Civil War is one of those subjects that's starting to penetrate the mainstream, especially on the right.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like there's a and there's two versions of it, right? There's a meme version where it's like very lightly understood, but then there's people doing the actual reading and research, which tells a very different story because most people have uh a very superficial understanding of it based on less of like actually reading, for example, about what like
Hmm.
Hemingway was actually doing in Spain and like all of the stuff that he was producing because he was siding with the quote unquote republic, which were the Reds,
Mm,
frankly. And then there's the George Orwell,
right.
people who again don't actually read Homage to Catalonia most of the time, and if they do, you're like, oh, this guy sucks. He's awful. It's a good thing that a Carla shot him in the neck, but you know they don't really know much about it. They know these basic concepts, and then on the right we have Franco, who's great, and I
Yeah.
agree, but it's a very superficial like meme based understanding most of the time,
Right.
whereas the real story is incredibly interesting and I think not only important for us to understand, just for our own knowledge and as we revisit the subject of the 20th century and reassess what we know or think we know about that period, but also there's a lot of really important things that we need to learn from that experience because in many ways they map very closely to what's taking place here in the United States.
Yes, and that's one thing. And I just got Stanley Payne Civil War in a couple of days ago. I'm about, I don't know, three chapters into it.
Great.
I'm not well read on the subject, so I'm not even going to pretend like I know the subject well. What I know about the Spanish Civil War is listening to you and Pete, three of y'all's four episodes on the subject. So that's about the extent of my knowledge. So this is really going to be an educational podcast for me too, and getting to understand not only what was going on back then, but also the parallels with modern society. But I can tell you this, one of the first things I noticed when opening the book and starting to read is the language that was used by the left is almost identical.
Yes, absolutely.
Why is that? Like where does this phenom come from? By calling I believe you said it's pretty common to for the left and Marxists to be calling anybody who is even leans in the capitalist direction to call them fascist, and this is where the term came from. Can you start us off there and kind of where
Sure.
these terms came from, where this language came from, and why we keep hearing it crop up in 2025?
Yeah, absolutely. So fascist is a term that was coined by the actual Italian fascist movement, right? So and it's based upon the Roman fasces, which is a symbol of authority in Roman, symbology, and you see them all over, the United States Capitol, in the houses of Congress, etc. Right? It was on our pennies until I think 1946. So it's a symbol that's been around for a very long time, and it became the label that was applied to everyone resisting basically Bolshevik revolution. And anarchists use the same term because they're two peas in a pod, going back a very long ways. Other than the fact that anarchists are very good at being slaughtered by communists, which is one of the things I find endearing about anarchists. But the the long and the short of it is, it's a scare word, and it's like a slur to an average person who isn't a fascist, who is just like a normal, like, for example, traditional Christian, who is very confused by all this. But the very act of resisting what is seen as, the inevitable progress of history, which is, socialist revolution, and the tearing down of the old order, under the original. This comes out of the original thinking from Marx, which is that this is this natural evolution which takes place, based on stages of development, right? And so you're in the way of history, like you're resisting the natural course of humanity and history, and so you're the worst thing ever. And so the label fascist was grabbed and thus applied to everyone. And there's some very interesting commentary on this in Spain, where let's see, I'm going to pull this up really quickly because I just published an article uh, written by a Spanish fellow who who's been helping me research from a bunch of this Spanish material. When I was writing my novel Faction with Crusaders, I had to do like 5 or 6, 7 years worth of research, reading about the Spanish Civil War. And so when I was writing, I was asking the Spanish fellow that I've been in contact with some years on niche social media, about, you know, terminology and turns of phrase to make sure that my framing was accurate. It wasn't too modern. But then also, I want to be sure that I'm using certain kinds of slang that would be used in Spain, or colloquialisms, for example.
Mm.
And so, in the right before the uh, military uprising, which is what began the Spanish Civil War in July 1936, there were all kinds of events that took place and accelerated the process, to where the Spanish right, who had been working behind the scenes with one another and communicating behind the scenes with one another, said, "It's go time. There's no choice except war at this point." And their goal was to do essentially a coup, a decapitation strike of the government, and then just impose martial law because of the just sheer volume of street violence. And right, like 2 days before that military uprising, there was a speech in the Cortes, which was the Spanish parliament, by Jose Gil Robles, who was a pretty moderate right winger, talking about, basically stating the right wing's case for why they were doing this and how illegitimate the government was. And this is a long way of wrapping around back to your point about using specific terminology to label the enemy and their enemy, and which is often just normal people. And so the here it is. here it is. So let me find this here really quickly. It's not leaping into my lap.
Love it when that happens.
Yeah, it's lovely. But it makes the case so well. Okay, here it is. Here it is. No wonder it's embedded way down in this paragraph that I was looking at. So, uh, just describing the resistance. It is nothing but a yearning, and this is quoting Jose Gil Robles in Parliament in July 1936. We hear daily voices saying the same thing. You are being cast out of the law. They are burying the democratic principles. They are laughing at their liberal ideas contained in the Constitution. You cannot do anything either through the law or the Parliament. This clamoring from the countryside and the cities is growing and developing into what you choose to call fascism, but it is nothing but a yearning, in most cases noble and justified, to free themselves from a yoke of oppression that, in the name of the Popular Front, which was this left-wing coalition that was a Soviet, communist international innovation, the government and groups that support it are imposing upon vast sectors of the population. This is a movement of healthy and even holy rebellion, which ignites the hearts of the Spaniards against those to whom we are totally impotent. Day after day, we held ourselves fast in the principles of democracy, legal norms, and normal actions. In the same way, the government and its many organizations is overwhelmed by the working masses that you have no control over. We are totally overwhelmed by a desire for violence which you have created and spread through all of Spain. When you talk of fascism, don't forget, members of the government, that in the elections of February, the fascists managed to get barely 1,000 votes. If these elections took place today, their majority would be crushing, because even workers' organizations, betrayed by misdirection, yearn for a freedom from your vague lies or fantasy. It finds purchase in people when they are at the edge of despair and ruin, end quote. So overall, what they call fascism is simply a reaction to communism from people who say, we don't have like a nice democratic way of getting our way out of this process. We just want it to be over. We want the street violence and the disorder and the illegitimate government where you impose rules on us, anarcho-tyranny, for example, where you impose violence from the mob, and then if we resist, you arrest us for violating the law, etc. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. So where did this whole idea, maybe it was an actual quote, but there's this idea, and I found myself even as early as late as last week, mimicking this idea that fascism is an economic term that was trademarked by Mussolini, and it was better known as corporatism, etc. Like, how did that get perverted in the nomenclature? Was Mussolini trying to kind of soften the word and utilize it for his own ends, or was there an actual fascism to what Mussolini was doing?
Well, so his movement was fascism, and we misuse the term now, where everything that's bad is doing a fascisms, right? Like you
Mm,
you see you see conservatives, say, well, the left are the real fascists, and it's like, well, not really, because these words mean things, and then they point to like socialism, which is used. There's National Socialism from Germany, and Mussolini had been a communist, or at least a member of the Italian Communist Party. And then, and to be candid, I don't consider myself extremely well versed on the Italian scene of that
yeah.
era, but I know enough. So I'm painting with a very broad brush right here. But in general, they were applying a label onto their thing, and Mussolini's take, which gets uh, deliberately misinterpreted later on, is essentially saying, look, uh, the left sometimes has some good points about certain kinds of social issues, especially in Europe of the late 19th and early 20th century. It wasn't America. Like America evolved in a certain way where, frankly, our working class in the 20th century was in a very strong place, and some of that came from the labor movement, but an awful lot of it was just the fact that you had skin in the game, and there was only so much that the employers could get out of you. Whereas, and we had education and all kinds of advantages in terms of access to material. Think of it this way, Tommy. Like when you go to a mill town in the Pacific Northwest, where I am from, you can go and see houses that were built 100 years ago that are pretty nice houses that were for just regular mill workers. And almost everyone would hunt, and so and fish and gather shellfish and stuff like that. And so you could eat very well, and you were among the best paid working people in America in that era if you were working in the timber industry, for example. It's a
Yeah.
hard life, lots of injuries, lots of early death, etc. But you could do very well raising your family and living a nice kind of natural life.
Yeah.
In Europe of the time, that wasn't necessarily the case, especially for people who were leaving the countryside and going to work in the cities. Similar arguments here in America, but generally, depending on a lot of different scenarios, there's this continuity, and kind of depending where you were and what your circumstances were in Europe would determine that a lot. Like, for example, we all know that Marx was very off about his theory of like the proletariat rising out of these more advanced, capitalist nations, where his revolution took hold was either seething minorities in certain countries, or in basically, and where it was really successful was like in agrarian countries, specifically Russia and China,
Mm.
just painting with a very broad brush.
Right.
So Italian fascism was basically looking at what was going on socially and politically in Europe and saying, we can't we don't want to divide all these people against each other. We don't want to divide the classes and the regions against each other. We don't want to destroy Christianity. We don't want to destroy our country. And we certainly don't want to be part of this international Bolshevik tendency that which was not only non-Italian, but it was also non-Russian, right? I don't know
Yeah.
how spicy you get on your show, but wink, wink.
Yeah.
And that was the 100% normal understanding in the whole world in like the teens and 20s as to what was going on in Russia. Like, people knew this.
Mm-hmm.
So what they needed to do is they needed to say, we need to find a way to address social ills in Italy to neutralize this as a weapon against our society, because we don't want Italy overthrown in a communist revolution. We want Italy to remain Italian and proudly Italian, but we do want to be a strong country and unified at all class levels. We want people who are on the very bottom rungs to have appeals, which they used to have through the church and kind of standard orders, and through various modalities, as is very traditional in Europe. Less so in some parts of Italy, but like northern Italy in the cities, people lived and worked and had a very high standard of living going back hundreds and hundreds of years, even working class people quite often. So, this whole capitalist abuse through the centralization of people and deracinization and stripping them away from kind of their traditional way of being, is a huge amount of the problems that were taking place at the time. And so under fascism, you would have this methodology where everyone's arguments and counter arguments would be administered centrally, so that instead of having strikes, for example, in a you know in a factory, everyone would get together and it would be talked out and figured out. Again, theoretically, everyone still needs coming back to work. You're going to get paid a little more. Your conditions need to be improved by the factory owner and stuff. People were very happy with Italian fascism in Italy before World War II.
Okay.
They were very happy with it because they were seeing the progress that they had wanted, and it wasn't this bloody revolution to try to overthrow the whole society. So, after the victory of whatever you want to describe it, as our friend Thomas 777 would say, the Nuremberg regime in 1945, you now have this really handy, like, fascism is bad. But,
Mm-hmm.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt thought that Mussolini was fantastic, in the early days before he allied with the Germans and they started making moves. And a lot of the disputes and kind of American orientation that FDR had, opposed to these activities, were heavily influenced by the British and British intelligence. And the British always want to dominate Europe, or at least neutralize Central Europe and any other powers rising in Europe, right? So uh, it, it's this thing where the world was tending in this direction, and so you would generally be moving towards like a Bolshevik form, or more of this like right wing, rightful authority type orientation was the perception at the time. If you read things in the 20s and 30s, progressivism saw this as us moving into a new world. Progressivism isn't just this, what we consider it now, this leftist corny, like, denial of reality, right? There was a lot of highly ambitious attempts to solve real social problems,
Mm-hmm.
some of them in ways we would like, and some of them in ways we look back and go, that was appalling. But nonetheless, that was kind of the umbrella that all this stuff was fitting under. So when you defeat these systems, uh, this means that certain people, you're essentially saying our default is being opposed to those kinds of uh, reconciliations and that way of operating. And so moving forward, when debating in the United States, you have these, there's the bad guys, and I can apply this label to you to slander your approach or your suggestion to a potential policy thing, or an ideological thing, or an economic thing, or whatever you want it to be, as being the bad label. And then I win the argument because you say, no, I'm not a bad guy, I'm a good guy. And so I can orient you away. I can neutralize your ability to make those kinds of arguments.
Yeah, I've often said that progressivism is completely misunderstood. I did a podcast a few days ago trying to break it down a little bit, saying that, there's a left and a right progressivism. You can look at
Yeah,
like the early 20th century when you had Teddy Roosevelt and you had Woodrow Wilson.
totally.
And it was like a reaction to the Industrial Revolution.
Correct.
And so, and that's kind of, and then it just kind of devolved into its current state. The neocon ended up being more of the right wing progressive, whereas you had like the Alexandria Ocasio Cortez's, the Democratic Socialists of America, and you had the neo libs who were like balancing the left wing progressivism. And so it's not so easy to kind of parallel the way that American politics have reacted over the 20th century to the way that European politics have reacted over the 20th century. when it comes to Spain and you saw these factions in the left pop up, what was happening in Spain in the early 20, what was it? It was like the late 19th century, wasn't it? Whenever all this really started. Am I
Yeah,
correct on that?
absolutely. Yeah, that's true. So Spain, it's interesting. So I did an episode with Pete on the nineteenth century Spanish leftism, which kind of it really talks about the real genesis and the origins of how these different expressions came about and how certain of them, specifically anarchism, came to be dominant. And so I like to refer to them as Pope Pius. Is it this? I forget which number he was. I'm not Catholic, so I'm very bad at keeping track of
I'm
these things.
Orthodox. I'm not Catholic either. So,
Okay, yeah. So, but Pope, the Pope at the time of the Spanish Good Guy victory, described the enemy as the apostles of atheistic materialism,
hmm,
and so I frame it as what kind of libtards were they?
yeah,
So, if you go back to look at what was going on in Spain in the late 19th century, which really created the anarchist movement, um, or at least the real genesis and kind of cohering of it under a specific kind of ideological and thought movement, a social movement, was really the genesis of that was October 1868, and a gentleman by the name of Finelli, specifically Giuseppe Finelli, who was a Neapolitan Italian Republican, who had become basically a missionary for anarchism, and he was associated with Mikhail Bakunin. He was also a member of the International Working Men's Association, which was the first international. So, what evolved into a communist organization started out in its first iteration as getting together all of the kind of left movements internationally, because they had had the revolutions of 1848 and all the various stuff going on in Europe in the 19th century, right? So, like, uh, there was revolution in Italy where they were attempting to not only get independence from the Austrians but also unify the country. And there was a very strong leftist socialist orientation, and some of them were very, like, what their term would be, libertarian, so anarchist. And then, in America, I believe that the use of the term libertarian in America was a Trojan horse. And I used to consider myself a libertarian. I believe it was a Trojan horse, or because the way that it was proselytized to us was, if you're a smart white guy who doesn't like the, like, 90s Clinton Democrat and Bush oriented neocon republicanism,
hmm,
but you kind of want to be left alone, and you kind of want to have a way of saying, I'm not part of these dumb mainstream movements. Is you can be libertarian, and it's really nice because you just want to leave people alone and be left alone, right?
yeah,
But libertarian, it means something very specific in Europe, and specifically the real root of it is from Spain, where it's a form of anarchism, and we don't see libertarianism in American politics as being anti-Christian. We just don't think of it that way, but it was absolutely anti-Christian in Europe.
hmm,
Not anti some specific church, but anti-Christian,
yeah,
because you have to throw off all shackles of oppression, which includes, religious instruction, which would constrain you from, the behavior, the lowest forms of behavior, which is very freeing and liberating, right? And it's okay to do horrible things to your class enemies. So, uh, uh,
We would
you know,
call that would be more like libertine in our modern vernacular.
sure, yeah, but I think that that's what libertarianism is
Yeah.
now. Like, if you look at the party, it's it's absurd. It's certainly not the
That's
intellectual.
true.
It's not the intellectual titans that I and possibly you, and I know Pete for sure, came up with in
Right,
the
right.
90s and aughts. Like that,
Yeah,
there was like real meat, real intellectual meat to a lot of that. And
yes.
I think a fair amount of it was wrong, or it was like reasoned. As I look back at it, and like I just read a Sam Francis piece, and again, I like Sam Francis. I like the way he writes, but I see a lot of these things that are just like really obvious to me from his piece on anarcho tyranny that I was just rereading because I'm going to do a podcast about it. I remember reading it when it came out, July 1994. I remember reading it
Mm.
at the time, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." And then now I just see the flaws coming through it, And but I also understand his position. I'm not misunderstanding it. I just think that the past like 30 years have proven, certain parts of it, like, yeah, I can kind of agree with the principle here, but certain parts of it don't really make sense. But anyway, that was a
Right.
long digression. It sounds nice to be like, oh well, we're trying to find order, and so going back to Spain in the 19th century, um, Marxism postulates that the right way to do this, or the natural way to do this, so we might as well get on the train of what's natural and scientific, right? We should just listen to Karl Marx.
Mm.
He was very domineering in the way that he engaged with everyone, and the Bakunin, his kind of anarchist opposite, loved pointing this out. And the long and the short of that is that oh well, there's this historical materialist process. Societies develop through material development and class conflict. There are preconditions to every stage of progress, and so ultimately, Marx said, ultimately there would be a stateless system, right?
Hmm.
But we have to go through the dictatorship of the proletariat to get there. The anarchists argued correctly that the dictatorship of the proletariat would deteriorate into totalitarianism, right?
Mm.
And so their argument was, we just need to wreck everything right now and have everything be strictly voluntary. So beginning in the late 19th century, that this the anarchist argument resonated tremendously in Spain. When Finelli went there in 1868, other evangelists from the International Working Men's Association with the communist factions and other socialist factions were also going to Spain, because Spain was in a period of liberalizing, where the government, it kind of took a lot of the kind of old constraints off of them. The first Spanish Republic, which only lasted 11 months, was instituted in 1873. But during this couple of decades, they're in this very liberalizing phase in the central government, and all the kind of the roots of the political parties that were going toe to toe during the Civil War were being founded, whether they were communist, whether they were some form of like in between socialist, whether it was purely like Republican. But in this case, Republican was typically anti-church uh,
Mm.
in Spain at the time, because they were in opposition to the royal system, as well as the constitutional monarchy that was imposed in 1876. They wanted a centralized government where church and state were separated. The Catholic Church was, if not completely eradicated, basically made irrelevant politically. And in that way, they were totally in line with the communists and the anarchists. And so by the time we get to the 1930s, they've gone through multiple decades of these parallel institutions among anarchists and socialists being created. The right wing had also done the same thing, where they had parallel institutions. And a lot of times these are expressed as kind of like regional differences, where, you'll have really strong, for example, Carlist, which is traditionalist Catholic, monarchist movement in kind of northeastern Spain and northern and northeastern Spain, but in pockets of elsewhere. They have a whole bunch of different diffused labor unions. Some of them are like Catholic and right wing. Some of them are leftist, and they're all associated with political parties, right? So all these people have been kind of decentralizing and doing their own thing, while the central government kind of tried to tamp everything down and tamp the foment and street violence down. But the street violence had been picking up. And during the early 20th century, the government cracking down on political street violence, primarily from the left, but a lot of reaction from the right, was a thing. It was a big thing. There were basically like youth street gangs, for the libtards and the right wing, who would, for the right wing, for example, the Carlist youth auxiliaries would protect religious processions and political meetings, and any kind of activity against attack by anarchists. Sounds pretty familiar from the past like 8 years, right? Proud Boys and those guys. So the same concept. And then there was a dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, which was really a military coup with a titular head, but it was just the right wing working with the crown to tamp down on basically an attempted Bolshevik and anarchist revolution in the wake of World War One, as was happening in the rest of Europe. So they were cracked down by a military dictatorship, and then that was all lifted at the end of 1930, early 1931, and the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed after an election. The mood was such that the king fled the country, and then immediately all these different factions start just mobilizing on the street. Church burnings begin, a lot of attacks against prominent traditionalists and conservatives, and religious personnel start getting attacked, and the central state doesn't really do much. The Republic creates a new law enforcement agency that's loyal to the Republic by picking loyalists to these primarily left-wing political parties, that are called the Assault Guards, that are a subset of the National Civil Guard. So law enforcement in Spain was national and federal at the time, so controlled by the central government. Enough of the kind of older law enforcement agencies had enough like traditionalists and such in it that the Republicans felt that they needed to have a new like rapid reaction team that would mostly go after their enemies. Well, here's the problem. When the anarchists are going ham and basically attempting revolutions every 2 years, the government has to tamp it down, because it prevents the government from slowly instituting this stuff on their own and maintaining order so that the right doesn't react. So it's this vicious cycle that surges every time there's a new atrocity by the left, and the right wing wants to crack down on them. In 1934, there's an uprising. It becomes known as the Asturian Uprising, but it was an attempt across the entire country to overthrow the government. Um, it, and it's just a lie that that's not the case. What was the justification for that? Lawfully, legally, uh, there was an election, and the right won handily because in 1932, 1933, basically the church was forbidden from being. They outlawed religious education. They outlawed religious processions and public displays of faith in Spain, which is insane because when I think Spain and when I've been in Spain, it's
Yeah.
public displays of religious faith. They nationalized religion, all Catholic property, and so basically, instead of your tithing going to charity, uh, you had to pay rent to the state to keep access to a cathedral that had been there for 500 years. You know, and then there was also some land reform, which was a tricky one because there were phases where the right, particularly the Carlists and the Falange, again being that kind of fusion of wanting to address and wanting to be a response to leftism, and say, yes, there are scenarios where we do need rightfully imposed social justice and adjustments to some serious problems, such as the landless peasants in southern Spain. We need to do something about their situation, but it has to be done judiciously, and thoughtfully, and not just, the violent peasants win and the property owners lose. Like, we can't do that. We need this to be done justly. And who got rid of those latifundia, those vast estates in southern Spain that the landless peasants were basically treated as like lower than slaves? Francisco Franco got rid of it.
Yeah.
So it was just a bubbling cauldron of violence and social strain. And one of the most interesting expressions of it that I've ever seen is there was I can't remember exactly who said it, but there was a fellow talking about being on a public tram in Barcelona in 1936, and he said there was this beautiful, like 20-year-old upper middle class girl who was dressed nicely, who was on the tram, and at a stop she gets off and walks by him, and he was struck by her. And I believe that he was a leftist at the time, but then a worker sitting next to him was just seething, and he's like, that rich pig, like filled with hatred.
Mm.
And he said, if you have social conditions uh, that are in such a state that he can't just like appreciate a beautiful young woman, that he's like seething with hatred that she's his class enemy, like, you have serious problems. And so he was not surprised when the war happened.
And and when did the war kick off?
So the military uprising in July of 1936 was specifically the actual date was the 17th or 18th, depending on where you were at in the country. So there were some
Okay.
slight delays. And the
Well, yeah, they didn't have Facebook.
correct
Yeah. So
communication was an issue. And so it's kind of funny because the Francisco Franco did not formally join and sign on to the conspiracy to arise until July 13th, 1936, when Jose Calvo Sotelo, who was a leading traditionalist politician, was assassinated by the Republic's assault guards.
mm,
And the really interesting thing is the this kind of conspiracy was informal and ongoing, and just kind of discussions between guys who knew each other. There were war buddies in the military, and then branching out into political parties, ongoing during the Republic. And these are just people who would just know each other from for various reasons. And then as things progressed, a major portion of real political maneuvering was less how do we deal with the working within the state, within the Cortes, the parliament. It's more like how do we coordinate with, like, and find our allies and friends behind the scenes, people that we might have some political disagreements with, but we're all like Catholics,
Yeah.
and we're not gonna just like sit back while this is done to us, while our country is taken from us and our children are transed, basically.
Right. It's like this loose, a lot like the loose coalition you see within the Trump administration, where you have,
Correct.
traditional Democrats like RFK joining with, I'd call Trump a Clintonite.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He reminds me of Bill Clinton and like policy wise. And it's just this kind of like loose coalition where you have Stephen Miller, who's probably, the furthest right of the entire administration.
Yeah.
It's like but it's kind of like it's almost like common sense versus, this lunacy, this anti-human kind of
Correct.
like desire. So you had the kind of the same organic response in Spain when you look at it with from what I all right, so like the easy kind of like layman's history of the Spanish Civil War is, well, the left was winning, the government was basically impotent to do anything about it, so these fascists rose up and started fighting back, and
Yeah.
that's kind of like how it's drawn out for the layman.
And that's, that's not, if you talk to Stanley Payne, as you were pointing out, he will tell people that Francisco Franco was not an, according to Hoyle, fascist. Right?
Mm-hmm.
He did work with people who were explicitly ideologically fascist, and he did consolidate the Catholic traditionalists and the Falange into a single political party that was centered on the army, um, that basically mushed the two parties together,
Mm-hmm.
and made it the only political party, the only legal political party in Spain. And it was because his point was the time for like party politics and factionalism is over. We need to crush the left, and we need to not allow leftist foment.
Mm-hmm.
So during the war, there will be, like, we will march in lockstep with one another. We will have one party, one army, and one state, because we don't want to be fighting each other. We will make allowances for each other. You can keep your symbols, you can keep your ideology, and then we'll all sit at the same table and figure this out. But
Mm-hmm.
tactically and strategically, the army is in charge, and you'll be integrated into it, and the way that you behave determines kind of your place at the table later. And so they all got with the program. There was competition between those factions under the Franco regime periodically, and it would be stamped out. And Franco's rule was basically, while I'm alive, no politics, like none of this nonsense. But he was also very non-ideological in that all he cared about was like what worked for Spain. So
Mm-hmm.
they would attempt all kinds of economic things just to see if it worked or not. they would say, okay, Falanghe, you have these interesting ideas about national syndicalism, for example, which isn't necessarily left wing or right wing. It's just, you know, we meet together and we have limited resources. And so we look at what our goals are, who can provide these resources, what mines are we going to get it from, what's the most efficient place to process this mineral. It's probably going to be up in these old industrial areas in the north. So yes, let's do that. Who can do it? Great, you'll take that contract. The workers will say, well, we need to be sure that the workers barracks in these areas are really bad. We need to, if we're supposed to meet these levels of production, we need these accommodations. Okay, we'll find a position. Maybe the government will pay for some of it. Maybe the employer will pay for some of it. Here's what your pay is going to be. Make sure the food is good enough, everything like that. It's really not that bad when you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
The Bolsheviks claim that they did it that way, but they would just make diktats. And
Right.
so in the late 20th century, when you talk about these programs, well, we fought against those guys and we were on the same side as the communists, but then we decided communism was bad, even though we propped up the communists, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
communists would not have won without our massive provisions and manufacture of weapons and ammunition and just giving it to them for free. And then continuing to feed them for decades, right, with our grain. And so a real nice, easy scapegoat of things, or a way to dismiss ideas that are, kind of these in between, like in between solutions for cooperation, let's say, you call it fascist and say, well, that's doing a fascisms, and we crushed the fascists. And don't you know that the guys who fought in World War II were the original anti-fascists, which is hilarious, because if you act like your grandpa who and think like your grandpa who actually fought in World War II, like, you're a fascist. So
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
it's it's,
Yeah.
it's
They
totally
they
it's totally
they
absurd.
killed Charlie Kirk for thinking like my grandpa,
100%, exactly. Well, which was fairly moderate, really.
Yeah.
Like, and that's the best thing about all this, is that he was a total moderate, and they killed a moderate voice who wanted to just have open dialogue.
Hmm.
Okay, thanks for setting the table stakes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was like one of my first takeaways when I was like, because I didn't follow Charlie Kirk closely. I mean, I knew who he was, and I enjoyed some of his stuff. Like he did the interview with Curtis Yarvin. I thought that was interesting,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know. And I was actually surprised the amount of reading he had done into like kind of the dissonant right direction. And
yes.
I was like, wow, that's impressive. I was unaware that he was familiar with this stuff and these ideas. And then they kill him, and I'm like, you just killed like a Reagan conservative for being hateful and radical. Like there is nothing
Exactly.
less radical than a Reagan conservative.
But he's standing in the way of the inevitable, like, tranny victory of like post-capitalist tranny whatever. Like, it's completely insane. Yeah, they're it I think it what is really relevant about that, the way Jay Burden put it, is he said, Charlie Kirk shot, discourse killed.
Mm.
And so it's like, he was a, like you said, Reagan conservative, attempting to talk to everybody and to persuade them to his way of thinking, and they killed him. And so they certainly think that we are far worse than he is. Although that's also us making an assumption, because we understand this continuity of, like,
Hmm.
ideology, that we see ourselves as farther right from him. The left doesn't. The left sees him as a prominent, very powerful person who was really instrumental in getting the Trump term 2 coalition put together.
Yeah.
Uh, and I didn't know that until after he was killed and people started talking about it. And I'm like, this is interesting. He was way more than we thought he was. We thought he was a kind of a goofy guy who was again a Reagan conservative, but he was much more than that. We also thought that he was a shill for Israel, and it turns out that especially platforming Tucker Carlson, to use their terminology, leftist terminology. He very much was challenging those things, at
Yeah, his
least a
ideas
little
were
bit,
much more nuanced than I
much more.
originally. Yeah. And okay, so I feel that going forward, and I could be wrong about this, and we're not really talking about Spanish Civil War now, but I don't.
But we
I
are.
think, yeah, but we are. I think going forward as a symbol, like he's going to be much more powerful as a symbol moving
Yes.
forward, kind of like a
Yeah.
Martin Luther King Jr. type. So when it happened, I was out fishing that day, and I was driving home, and I stopped at the grocery store, and I happened to look at YouTube, and I saw Glenn Beck had a video up that said, "Pray for my friend Charlie." I was like, I wonder what Glenn Beck's talking about. I'll have to check that out later. And I scrolled down a little bit more, and Megan Kelly was doing a live stream, and it said "Breaking Charlie Kirk's shot," and I was like,
Yeah.
"What?"
Yeah, I
So I
know.
clicked on that, and I was listening to that as I'm going through the grocery store at 2:30 in the afternoon, and I get home, and I go and I tell my wife, and she goes, "Yeah, I know. I've never heard of this guy." Her sister, who lives in New Zealand, was messaging my wife about it. And
Wow.
I was like, holy crap. And she goes, why does everybody know who this guy is? And I went outside and I started thinking about it, and I started looking, and I looked at X, and I'm a big UFC fan. And a lot of the
Mhm.
guys I follow on X, even though I'm not on there very often, a lot of the accounts I follow are fighters. And the fighters were all messaging about it. And I was like,
Interesting.
I walked inside and I said, I figured it out. And she goes, what? And I go, this is as big as when Malcolm X was killed.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And she
He's a
was like,
martyr.
yeah. And she goes, no. And I said, I swear. I said, look at
It
this.
is.
And I
Yep.
showed her like people like that are like only involved in MMA, have nothing to do with politics whatsoever, like all posting about it. I was like, this is crazy. And sure enough, in South Africa, they held a memorial to him the next day at the
Wow.
uh, U.S. Embassy in South Africa. I mean, it
Wow.
was huge, and I was like, this is nuts.
Yeah, that's so it's interesting because the speaking of the Spanish Civil War, so there were people saying that this is like Jose Calvo Sotelo, like I was talking about.
Hmm.
Um, and I think comparatively it's not, but it shows where we're going or where we could be going if they don't tamp down on this. He could be a figure kind of like that. Like obviously that's not the case because it's been a month and not nearly enough action has been taken cracking down on the left. Like there's a fair bit against Antifa and the like, but like it just takes a long time. Like we can't act quickly anymore.
Right.
Um, the a possibly similar person in terms of being like a martyr figure was Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. So he was the son of the dictator from the 1920s, General Primo de Rivera. And Jose Antonio founded the Falange Española de las Llanes, which was a consolidated, basically playing with fascist ideas. So um, a more modern, youthful, energetic reaction to communism while still being Catholic, but having a lot of interesting ideas: modernism, futurism, like I said, national syndicalism, and elitist regeneration, because what they were pointing out was that, and again, they didn't necessarily know what was going on in other political parties. They saw the old traditionalist political parties engaging with the republic as very moribund and just like decrepit old men, and like not energetic and not understanding what time it was.
Mm.
In reality, um, in these political parties behind the scenes and in their youth movements, people were very energized. And it's kind of like when we look at the Republican Party right now, right? And as we think about it, like, the Republican Party sucks. I mean, they suck. Their leadership sucks. We see this thing with the young Republicans. The people running the young Republicans are like leftists, and they're just like latching on. Sometimes I'll use the term libtard for Trump, to describe a certain type of person who they have an instinct that is kind of correctish, but they also regurgitate all these leftist tropes that are so ingrained in them that they just can't even conceptualize. They can't
Right.
understand how liberal they are. Like people who make appeals to Martin Luther King Jr. and his ideals are that way, right?
Mm.
It's like you don't
Yes.
know what you're talking about, but you actually probably mean well. And so, like, when you talk with these people in real life, I can't hate them. I can't be mad at them. These are my people. Like,
Hmm.
I understand them. They just don't know. And it's okay. And by being a bit of an elitist paternalist, like, I have a lot more grace for them, and a lot of it is because I'm actually a Christian. So, like, Christian elites, you have grace for people who don't know better.
Mm.
A non-Christian elite, sometimes they do, but generally they're an elitist, and like, by like looking down their noses at people, instead of going back to that old noblesse oblige concept. And again, I'm just a regular guy, but I'm talking about how I stay humble. Like, I can be like, yeah, I'm right about these things, and I know that I'm right. But when I'm wrong, and when I find out that I'm wrong, I'll admit it. I'll be the first person to say I was wrong about this. I'll be the first person to say I had really dumb ideas for a long time. And
Yeah.
so, like, we have to look at people that way. And most of them will just get with the program as the winds change, because that's what they do. And that's okay. Like, you can't be mad at them about that. And so, the Falange were almost nothing until they exploded with growth in July 1936. They had less than 20,000 members at that point. When the uprising happened, because they had an organization, because they had militias, when an uprising happens and you're not in the army and you want to participate, you can join a militia. And so they became a major player because they had a militia. Because a long time before, they said, yes, we're a political party, but we're really, this is a method for mobilization. The Carlists, um, the the Carlists had a political party, the Communion Tradicionalista, but they also had this citizen militia that had 10,000 fully trained, armed, equipped, organized guys trained up to a full military standard by spring of 1936 with 20,000 auxiliaries. And then by the end of 1936, they had about 85,000. So they were ramping up, getting ready for this. And so they also were way more right wing and ready to rock than their political front uh, looked. And so people kind of fell into these buckets, kind of depending on, the families they came from, and their regions. And then, do you want to be an edgy teen or not? So the edgier teens went with the Falange, whereas the guys, the farmers and workers who had big Catholic families, and were less, urban and suburban middle class, they fell in generally more with the Carlist Recates. And again, it was because, if you go to Nebraska and you're out in the countryside, and a guy is, he cares about football and his family and going to church, and he's pretty right wing, but he just doesn't have these necessarily. It's different now with the internet, but like he's generally not going to be as edgy in terms of like imagery and stuff as like a kid who's very online, who grows up in a suburban diversity, borderline hellhole that's
Hmm.
very you know um you know deracinated and alienated. He's going to be much more easily throwing in these more extreme and novel frames versus the
Right.
guy who's going to be like, well, I'm just going to march under the flag my great grandfather marched under,
Right.
you know. So you see a lot of that similarity playing out here, where really they're on the same side, and they might have slightly different ways of expressing it, and the imaging is different, and the leaders are different, but they're really all on the same side. And when they understood that, they understood it. And so the Falange and the Carlists, even though all these people say, oh, it's so funny and weird how they like mashed them together. No, in Navarre, in Spain, they mustered side by side with each other at the time of the uprising and
Hmm.
took weapons out of the same armory and marched off together. And they had their own like separate units. Like you can do your own thing, but we're all under the same command. Who cares?
Well, we saw this in Syria, right?
Yes.
With the Syrian civil war, you had 12 factions all fighting against the Assad regime, and one leader stepped up and took charge. All factions fell in under his control, and now he's the president of Syria.
Yep.
I mean, that's the way coalition fighting goes. A lot of, especially back in those days, the coalitions, a lot of them, as people have like speculated, are going to be regional because the community that you live within.
Correct.
And then
Correct.
as these coalitions kind of find each other throughout, the battlefield, so to speak, then you meet up, you kind of mesh together and create one force. I mean, that's kind of a natural. People are so indoctrinated by the way that our world works nowadays, and they forget what it was like when there were no cell phones. Like they
Correct.
forget
Correct.
that information traveled slowly, and that these coalitions, spanning an entire country, or like, just as I live in Texas, just the state of Texas would have
Yes.
taken months, to formulate and come
Yes.
together.
And that's, I think, and I'm glad that you emphasized that point, because to me, the one of the key lessons of the Spanish Civil War isn't the right one because they had all the guns and leftists are pussies. That's totally not the case.
I mean, that's part of
Um,
it, but
I
no,
disagree.
I'm
Yeah,
joking.
yeah, I know. But the point is, like, as we know, and this is just for the audience in case someone doesn't get what Tommy and I know and we're laughing about, is that those having 100 guns doesn't do you any good unless you hand them out to 99 other people, and
Right.
you, as a movement, as a single unit, go and do the thing in a coordinated fashion, thoughtfully, using intelligence. Ahem. So in the Spanish Civil War, the right consolidated, and the right would not have won. I 100% believe this. The right would not have won had these militias not been there to help take and hold ground, because it's great having a powerful military, but as we all know, that if you hold a mountain ridge, if you hold a ridge line in a mountain, it's much easier to keep people from leaving that valley and penetrating your territory than if you don't control that ridge, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're below the ridge, you can't advance, lacking air and artillery and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It's much easier if you just are already there. And
Hmm.
so they were already there. They were able to go in like side by side with the military and basically take over military bases and say, we're with the uprising. And if you resist, you'll be arrested. If you resist vigorously, you'll be shot. That's how you do it. That's how you do it. And that's how you take cities. That's how you take territory. Is you have people there who actually are ready to fight. And then you also, again, this is Spain. I'm not talking about us. This is
Yeah.
Spain. This is a podcast of peace. You go and you deal with your local enemies so that they don't do the same thing to you,
Yeah.
so that they don't do their own uprising in your town.
Right.
And so if you have a territory where you're the vast majority, and you're going to have to do the thing. And that's just the way these wars work. It's war. It's not pleasant. And that's really an incredibly important lesson that we can learn, and that it's a consistent theme throughout, is that they consolidated, and they were just with it. When Franco said in 1937, spring, it had been less than 6 months, he said, we are one party. The army and these two factions, these two political parties with their own militias, were one army.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna take away your symbols or your flags or your martyrs or your songs or any of that, but we're one army. By the way, you get access to our supply lines now, so it's to everyone's benefit, right?
Right.
And that's how you win. The left utterly failed at that because they immediately, the communists within the government, or even if they weren't an expressly like international communist party, even if there was some variation of Iberian socialist, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they were allied with the Soviet Union, they immediately said, okay, the Soviets are going to be supplying us with weapons, and we're going to institute a Soviet style army, because we have Soviet advisors, and we also have guys from our own political parties that they had sent to the Soviet Union during the 1930s under the Republic to get trained up in those Soviet military academies
Right.
to fight the war the Soviet way. And they worked in lockstep with the NKVD, and in the way that they ran everything. And that's why they had a red rank insignia with the little 5-pointed Soviet star,
Mm-hmm.
is because they were a communist army. They were
And
not a
just a quick aside,
republic.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
A quick aside, we've already seen this in the US, right? We had a report come out just after Charlie Kirk's death that armed queers of Salt Lake City had gone down to Cuba and trained, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
this is a very, very familiar kind of path. This also happened in South Africa, and I've mentioned this a bunch on my podcast. This happened in South Africa with the ANC. They went up into a northern African country and trained under the Viet Cong, by way of the Soviet Union. The Soviet
Yes.
Union had sent down directive to the Viet Cong to train the ANC. So the
Yep.
ANC re-entered South Africa as a terrorist organization and is now, 30 years later, 40 years later, the largest political party or the most powerful political party in South Africa. So a lot of these political parties start off as these terrorist organizations that run through.
Yes. Yeah, and just to find another commonality, the Falange and the Carlists, through their military connections, so their militias were being organized, trained up like special forces style, like force multiplier,
Mhm.
finding the natural leaders, who were part of senior members of these organizations, but also young and energetic and ready to fight. Um, they were developing their militias, and then in 1935, uh, these parties with their own funding, sent these guys to Italy, to get like, basically modern infantry training. So
Yep.
not just you know not just doing like basic operational stuff, like generally lightly armed and doing some like rifle shooting and pistol shooting, but going to Italy and learning to use grenades and mortars and
Yeah.
medium and heavy machine guns, and thinking more like big boy military, and getting that experience so that they could go back and then train. And again, these same organizations were acquiring weapons, whether it was domestically or from foreign sources, and flooding the country with them, just
Yeah.
like the
Think,
left is doing.
yeah, you could think contractors, like government contractors, like
Correct.
Blackwater type.
Correct. That's
Yeah.
exactly correct. And another thing, like I said, is the failure for the left to consolidate. One of the biggest problems that they had was that there was this thing among the Basques up in the north to kind of get some level of autonomy, and they had been fighting for this politically for years. They had a political semi-autonomy from the central government. That was just kind of the natural style of the way Spain worked.
Hmm.
Um, and then in the 19th century, it was taken away because of the Carlist uprisings. And then in the 1930s, there was a big element of the socialists in Basque country, who were often not Basque per se, ethnically or linguistically. They were like, no, this whole autonomy thing is a move by these traditionalists. Like, and
Mm.
so it wasn't this like singular separatist, like libtard separatist thing that it's often portrayed as. Uh, so there was a that was the Carlist heartland.
Mm.
Just because of old loyalties with that old family line, um, in the 19th century, when they'd had the three Carlist wars. That was really like, we want the old traditional way, not this libtarded government. That's
Yeah.
all it was. And so that weakened that coalition, so that when the war broke out, huge numbers, as soon as the Carlist Requete nationalist units and the Navarre brigades and those others, as soon as they were actually attacking Basque country and those lines, it was very, very easy for them to get their Catholic brothers on the other side of the trench line staring at them to surrender in droves as entire units. And then it was very quick to be like, okay, well, do you want to fight against the communists who are blowing up your churches and stuff as we advance into this territory, and blowing up your symbols of Basque tradition? And they would generally say yes. Some of them were seething leftists who would rather sit in a prison camp or build roads or whatever. But the other guys made very quick recruits into the Navarre brigades, because it was much better to have army food than to have labor camp food, right?
Yeah.
So, and then also, the sooner they could free uh, Basque country, the sooner their family was no longer under siege or surrounded by these seething leftists. So the North fell very quickly because of the traditionalists who were behind the lines up there. One of them being a engineer, several engineers actually, who were involved in building the fortifications to keep the nationalists out. They would design vulnerabilities into them, and they would also not only provide the plans through various means, and some of them got caught in the early days, caught and executed for doing this. But if they were able to escape over the lines and hand these plans over, it was very easy for the nationalists to break through, because they had the plans and the vulnerabilities. And so again, mass waves of surrender, and kind of a Chuhoi program, where entire companies of Catholics would come over and say, "Yeah, we'll fight with you guys against the guys that want to destroy the church." The other side of it also was, the big split was between the anarchists and the socialists slash communists. So the
Mm.
Republic uh, was like, and it goes back to these autonomy movements that we always hear about. There's a Catalonia, right?
Hmm.
There's that whole autonomy movement, and that was kind of split in similar ways, where there was a traditionalist Catholic Carlist movement uh, in Catalonia of Catalans who were traditionalist Catholics, and then there were the anarchists who wanted basically an anarchist government in Catalonia, who were generally not Catalan. They were usually like the urban poor workers whose families had, not always but often and slash usually, had come there from other provinces. So they were alienated among the Catalans, um, and they wanted this anarchist government. So they had that until mid late 1937, when anyone who resisted kind of the consolidation under the communist authorities within the republic, if they resisted, they got a bullet in the head. So the thing is, though, is they wanted to run things their way nonetheless, and there were still elements where they were able to do it, like their own forms of collectivism in the in agriculture and in factories and everything,
Hmm.
but not in the military sense.
It
They were
seems
very weak. Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say it seems like a lot of this is you would see like these ideological skirmishes popping up on the left
correct.
because they were so tied to their ideology, whereas
100%.
Franco made a very wise decision in saying, look, y'all can have your ideologies, but don't bring this into what we're doing here. I
100%.
have like a monopolization on the use of force in this country, in this nation. And by having the access to the goods, y'all can have access to these goods as long as y'all put y'all's differences aside, act
Yes.
as one nation, and defeat the enemy that is trying to take over this nation. And I
And
think that is a very smart way to go about it.
and to be honest, Tommy, I think that that's the natural inclination of the Spanish right at the time. We are different in America now. We're
Mm,
all special snowflakes, and a lot of it is because we're alienated and deracinated. But a lot of it is just America is different, and America 2025 is just very different. We just don't think that way. We
yeah.
don't have these deep, uh, you know, I know a lot of Southern guys in our thing, and if their family's been in a place, they've been there for 200 years, right?
Yeah.
My family is old, where I'm at, where most people just moved here, and my family's been here since the end of the Civil War, and on one side of my family, so like I feel those deep ties here, but most people around me don't.
Mm,
And so it's refreshing when I meet people who do have those kinds of ties and that kind of mentality, because I think that's a winning mentality, and we can like recreate it or get with it. And part of that, frankly, is rightful authority. It's the concept of hierarchy and rightful authority. Like as a father, I get it. It's all I care about is kind of like you said, is like what are the results going to be? I'll have a place in that, and if you're saying I don't have a place in that, you're my enemy. But if
yeah.
you say there's a place for you in this, I'm like, okay, cool.
Mm,
That's great. If there's a place for me and my family in a normal place for us to be, uh, bully, let's do it.
right.
And that was the natural tendency of the Spanish right, and I think that the problem with the American so-called right is that most of them are actually libtards. And so I love how many people, like you pointed out, Charlie Kirk, for example, right? Charlie Kirk was getting back to fundamentals, it seems. He was actually reading and understanding these fundamentals. And he had a job, he had a thing, and he had all these people that he had to make happy or try not to alienate too radically, so he had a way of going about it. um the rest of us can kind of just be a little more direct. And I think that if we have mentality of being like, I don't care to pick nat shit out of pepper in every interaction that I have with people around me. I just want to find like solid people who are friendly, who I can work with, and they don't have to have all the same beliefs about as me. I don't even have to know if they have all the same beliefs as me about certain subjects, like
Hmm.
certain foreign countries, for example. Like if this guy doesn't really care about it, like that's fine, because what we're working on is something locally. Now, ultimately, I should know that, like, if he has allegiances that are different than mine, like, I should ultimately know that and be aware of that and try to figure it out, but hopefully be able to neutralize that as an issue. But I'm not going to like cut off working with someone or
Right.
declare him to be my enemy because he's not in lockstep agreement with everything that I believe. There's also like these insane people who, like, I talk to Pete about this all the time. There are these insane people who like cut off their family because they don't have some specific opinion about something that they feel deeply about, but that doesn't really, like, your boomer mother doesn't necessarily have a reason to have an opinion on this subject,
Right.
or the opinion that you have, and it's insane to destroy your family, to alienate, any children that you might have from your parents, because of something that really isn't that important.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I mean, it's important to know and be aware of, but like your mother having a specific opinion on it, like it's not her job to have an opinion about Israel or Gaza or whatever,
Yeah.
or the war in Ukraine. It's not her job to have that opinion.
Yeah. If
uh
your 80-year-old grandpa says something racially insensitive, I mean, you can kind of be like, he's an 80-year-old grandpa. Like
I'll high
that's
five him and then say
yeah.
he's an 80-year-old grandpa.
Based.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally or if he says so, if he lives in a 95% white town and he says something about like, oh, I don't like so and so because of the racism or whatever. It's like, yeah, but you don't have to like live with diversity. So like your opinion doesn't matter. And so therefore I'm not mad at you because you're my grandpa anyway, right?
Right.
It's like
Right.
having these hard and fast opinions about like small subjects, things that aren't that important. It makes sense when you're arguing online with people, but not like when you're just like living and being a normal person. All good things to be aware of and think about and all that. Of course, you want to be sure you're not dealing with someone who's going to like stab you in the back. But
Hmm.
like most of the time, it really doesn't matter that much. And so, like, what really matters is, you know, being seen as a solid person in your community because you like are genuinely doing things that are relevant. Like you're involved with your kids, you're doing leadership with your some activity your kids are in, whether it's sports or scouting or whatever.
Hmm.
There's all kinds of Sunday school, whatever. Just do those things and you can have your opinions, and you have to have outlets for talking about them. You don't want it to be a big secret. You don't want to be like the secret racist in like a libtard place. I totally get that. That's totally different, right? That's totally different. But like, and the Spanish had that, and in a lot of ways we don't really have that unless we make it.
Right.
And so I think that that's where a lot of energy is going right now, and I'm seeing great things with that. I'm involved in a bunch of stuff along those lines as far as like rebuilding some of these structures that we don't really have. There's people kind of colonizing uh, existing structures like that, and it's just to have a place to live and operate. And that was a really key success for the Spanish. And the reason that we don't have that, the reasons are many and varied. They're not all conspiracies. Like some of them are kind of natural, some of them are deliberate. But those are the kinds of things that you have to think about.
Yeah, that's one of the things I try to do with this podcast. I've been at the Institute, the Libertarian Institute, since 2018. I worked with Pete over there when he was over there. And one of the things I made a decision about very early on is I'm going to try to take these ideas that these kind of like high-minded ideas, wherever they come from, and boil them down into the working man's kind of like perspective, because I still work a blue collar job. You know,
Yeah,
I work with normal people, and I want to be able to sit and have a conversation with those guys and express these ideas and these subjects, you know, whether it's about history or whatever, to them in a way that they can digest. Because my in my experience, at least here in Texas and in Louisiana, where I've lived most of my life between those two states, my experience, most people are instinctively right wing that I have
agreed.
interacted with.
Yeah.
And so if I can get the ideas to them in a way that they can understand them and not feel intimidated or looked down upon, then I'm doing a good job at podcasting and expressing these thoughts, ideas, and different philosophies or events of history. And that's kind of the goal as to what I'm trying to do. And that's why whenever we get here and we kind of go down this rabbit hole, I'm not like, no, let's pull you back to the subject. No, let's see where this goes, because this might be something somebody needs to hear, and we'll always be able to tie it back to the original purpose of the
Oh
of
yeah,
the
absolutely.
conversation.
And I always find, in a similar fashion, that just giving people permission to speak, like, and to express their thoughts. Because so I've, were you familiar with the Z Man?
No.
Oh, okay, all right. So he was a guy in our spheres who was he wrote every single day. He
Mm,
had a post every single day on his blog for more than a decade, and he had a weekly podcast, and he made the rounds, and Pete and I knew him pretty well, and anyway, but one of the things that he would always talk about is how most people are pretty reasonable. You don't have to guide them in a direction necessarily. You give them permission to speak, and then you know what to react against. And one of the things he also talked about is how there were the cloud people and the dirt people. And this is from the mentality of the cloud people. The cloud people are the coastal elites and aspiring elites, right? And they
mhm.
see everyone else as the dirt people. Well, I've been in and among these aspiring cloud people, and I know that they're not as good or as interesting or as thoughtful as the dirt people in my life. Like,
Yeah.
I come from a pretty solidly, like, middle class background, which has the overlap between the people who tend to be better off are the guys who, like, own a working class type business,
Hmm.
versus being an office worker, right? Although there are people who make lots of money from IPOs and stuff like that, but those are fewer and farther between. Most of the time the office worker is not doing any better than, like, a entry level welder, for example. So I'm used to these people. I know how they think, and when I float amongst them, there's also a huge element of people that are more like us, but they're keeping their lip buttoned. I just had a conversation with a guy yesterday where he was saying, I think he said there was a guy that worked with him for a little while, who didn't want to come into the office. He wanted to stay remote. And there were all these things about him that made him think that this guy was much more based, he was quite possibly a based guy, and he's, like, trying to keep it quiet because he's, like,
Mm.
super paranoid about things. Like, he wouldn't have, like, real conversations, but there were all these hints. Like, his grandmother was from Spain, and she taught him Spanish and would speak to him in Spanish, so he was fluent in Spanish.
Right.
Um, his wife was Afrikaans, and as you know, and as I know from my experience, if you're Afrikaans and you leave South Africa, you're based.
Yeah.
Like the libtards are,
She's dragging my ass back.
yeah. The libtards in South Africa are the English, you
Hmm.
know,
Yep.
and you know, there's some exceptions, and then also some other people who will have maybe a surname that appears to be English. Anyway,
Yeah.
the so basically he's like, but this guy's keeping his head down, and coming through COVID, um, COVID was like the explosion in the white collar world where all these people just like they had to choose a side.
Yeah.
And these are very clarifying moments because I saw a lot of people come right out and just address me. Like I had a guy I worked with for years who was like, yeah, I know I can tell you, I know I can talk to you about this. I got the first shot because I just was like, okay, I'm supposed to do this. And I just want to get back to business and work. But my wife and kids didn't get it because I wanted to be the guinea pig. And then I had
Hmm.
really bad reaction to it.
Hmm.
And they're like, and I feel like I can't tell this to anyone, but I know I can tell you. And
Yeah.
I was basically like, yeah, I never got that shit, and I never will. It
My
won't
mom got
happen.
my mom got fired because she wouldn't do it.
Damn. I mean,
Yeah.
we were playing chicken, but I was lucky in that the company I was at the time, we dealt with medical data, and
Hmm.
privacy law was a very strong element of our business. And our legal counsel was just like, "Are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
You cannot make a mandate of it, you know, for these people. There's no justification for it, and you would get destroyed. We could very easily get destroyed. Like our whole business is knowing how to handle certain kinds of data
Well,
related
right,
to someone
especially
that's
in that
ethical.
business because the people you're trying to mandate know that you can't mandate it.
100%, 100%. And
Yeah.
so we were just playing malicious compliance chicken. And so when it went away, you know, and the worst of the heavy-handed libtard HR pushes took place during that period also, especially with like Summer of Floyd and all that stuff. And that
Mm.
has a way of uh, people will say things very directly that they won't say, yeah, that they wouldn't have been comfortable saying in like 2019, for example.
Right.
The libtards, I mean. And then the right wingers, as soon as that, or people, or just normal people, right? That they had gotten so used to like listening and looking for cues and hints that people who had been really cagey would say to me like, I know I can talk to you about this, just because I can tell, that I can talk to you, and I've known you forever, so I trust you, so I'm going to take a chance.
It's like
And
living in a Dostoevsky novel.
100%, man, 100%. And so that was very clarifying. And that same thing was taking place in Spain. And the nice thing, like Pete always says this, the nice thing about Spain is everyone would tell you what they thought. And we're starting to see that more in American politics than ever
Hmm.
before. They
Yeah.
just come right out. They just come right out and say, you know, in Virginia, for example, like, I'm not gonna not support the guy who says he wants to blow the brains out of like two little white
Right.
children,
Yep.
and that you're a mortal enemy. I'm not going to not defend my guy, which means that they sympathize with that thinking as well. So we all know what the stakes are, and so but then they still have to pretend. They
Yeah.
still have to pretend. And it's really important for us to just take this seriously and know what's going on and organize and prepare, because it's absolutely going to happen here, unless we get the 20s in Spain equivalent here, where the government cracks down, because it has to come from that central authority. Otherwise, it's war. Like there's no other choice. And Pete likes to say that he thinks it's going to, depending on your region, Like if you're in a libtard zone, like it's way more dangerous for you
Hmm.
in the next decades.
Yep.
And I agree. I agree.
I was just talking to one of my boys the other day, and I told him, I was like, you need to be careful when you go to church. I
I
was like,
agree 100%.
I mean, I told him more than that, but that's as much as I'm going
Of
to
course. Of
admit to
course.
saying.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, yeah, that was again, that was the upswing, the ascendancy of the right was a reaction to the left covering for attacks on churches
Well, and
and church buildings.
what was crazy when I told him that I was talking to him the Thursday before that LDS church got
Eesh.
attacked.
Yeah,
And
we're gonna have a lot of that.
I got out of church and I looked at my phone and I was like, "Oh my God."
Yeah.
And I immediately sent it to him. I was like, "Did you see this?" And he was like, "Oh, geez." I was like, "Yeah."
Well,
I mean,
so
we
in,
got lucky. What was that? Was that last week? The week before last? We got lucky with that guy that showed up to that Catholic church with all them explosives, and he didn't set any of them off. Luckily,
yes, yes,
but
yeah. And the thing in Spain was the people doing the attacks, they may have been nihilists who hated themselves and didn't care about dying as much, but they wanted to keep doing it. Whereas in America, they're suicide attacks
yeah,
from just totally broken people.
hmm,
And so, that's even scarier
yeah,
because they don't care. They don't care about dying.
yeah. It's like you've taken like the kind of Islamist kind of fanaticism
Yes.
and mixed it in with this political ideology of the West, and it's getting dark. I mean, there are things that like we didn't talk about on the podcast today, and we don't have the time because I know we're over an hour and a half already. But like L.A. just they just issued a state of emergency because ICE officials are arresting illegal immigrants in Los Angeles. You had the attack on police cars last night in
Yeah.
Boston.
Yep.
You've had several in Chicago where they've rammed into ICE officials in Chicago. One lady got shot because she rammed into ICE officials and she had a I don't know if she had a pistol or a rifle, but she had a semi-automatic weapon is all I've been able to find out.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's getting pretty wild out there. And I moved out to the country out of the Houston area in 2016.
Good
I
move.
totally wanted to get out of there, but my kids still live in the suburbs of Houston. Whether it be Cypress, Katy, Pearland,
Yeah.
Magnolia, all in those areas. And so I, I do have to still worry about my kids and my mom and dad and, the things that are going on around those areas. But I got us out. My parents were selling 9 acres and so we bought the house and the property from them. And so we
Nice.
have kind of like this kind of getaway for anybody in the city area that needs to get away. It's like, okay, it's getting too crazy here. We're going to, dad's house, or whatever. So,
We're gonna return to that way of living, I believe,
right,
from
exactly.
economic as well as like safety reasons and social reasons too. Honestly, which is a good thing ultimately, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But man, plug everything you got going on. Tell us about your novel. I saw it today and I was like, man, I got to buy that. So I'll probably be getting that soon so I can
Thanks.
read it. And yeah, plug
Great.
everything.
All right. So, Karl Dahl, the best place to find all my stuff is my Substack, which is karldahl.substack.com. That's KARLDAHL.substack.com. I have two books on Amazon, Faction and Faction with the Crusaders. Faction with the Crusaders is my Spanish Civil War novel, and it's about a American who gets into the business of espionage within the framework of the Spanish Civil War. And then I'm also on Twitter, but Twitter is awful. But you can find me there under Caudillo Dahl. So thanks for having me, Tommy. Enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely, man. We'll do this again. Maybe we'll do a kind of a deeper dive at some point. But yeah, I think this is a really good overview and kind of let me get some stuff off my chest that I've been thinking about too. So I enjoyed it.
Great.
All
Thanks.
right, brother. I'm gonna stop the recording.